In 1940, the Imperial Japanese Ministry of War noted that after nearly 3 years of combat on the Chinese mainland, their opponents, far from being weaker, seemed to have increased in strength. The Chinese army now boasted 60 extra divisions, 1.5 million more rifles, 60,000 machine guns, and 2,650 additional pieces of ordnance. It was clear to the Japanese what the problem was: the Burma Road, the vital artery that kept Chiang Kai-shek's government in supplies. On February 8, 1940, Xu Haixing arrived in Yunnan's provincial capital, Kunming, for the first time. His arrival coincided with the Chinese New Year. Exactly 1 year before, he had left his family home in Southeast Asia to return to China and join the war against Japan. He now arrived in Kunming as a driver with a convoy of supply trucks.
到金马批街，那个时候刚好出柚子，云南柚子很出名的，一斤才2毛钱。
Although in the middle of the war, the streets of Kunming were crowded with people dressed up for the holiday. It was a festive atmosphere, with people seeking to forget their other troubles.
看电影，在昆明，我记得南平戏院开幕的时候，就是很多卡通片，小鹿斑比很出名，小鹿斑比，唐老鸭。
As the population of Kunming enjoyed a brief celebration, Xu Haixing and the other transport volunteers were preparing to put their lives on the line once again. The Japanese Army seizure of Vietnam put Kunming within 2 hours flying time for their bombers. A life-and-death struggle for China's vital artery now beckoned. More than 3,000 men had been recruited from the overseas Chinese of Southeast Asia. They provided the skilled drivers and mechanics needed to man the traffic on the road that was China's only link to the outside world.
每天都是危险的，为啥时候？每天晚上睡觉门就一起来，吃好饭，这是危险的。
Danger is the word Huang Tie-hun repeats again and again when recalling his wartime memories. Huang was a 21-year-old in 1939. Almost every day that he and his comrades were on the road, there were Japanese bombers above them.
丢了炸弹啊，都丢啊！看到他有，
他来一回都得救驾，3架。因为那时候中国根本就没有飞机，只有高射炮在想有没有打不到一架。
飞机来了，你车上有押运兵啊，那个叫押运兵。驾驶室一退，敌机来了，车子一停，吐到沟里面，我也不晓得啷个躲，他们啷躲我就跟他们躲。那么几个车子跟到我后面车子，蹦当炸死。
The exact casualty count of the overseas transport volunteers remains unknown. However, well over 1,000 of them died on the Burma Road from accidents, malaria, or enemy bombardment. The Xinhua Daily wrote this about the Burma Road drivers. Under increasingly intense air bombing, these volunteers remained active in transporting materials for China's frontline troops. It has been their heroic sacrifice that kept this critical lifeline open. The Gongor Bridge at Dali in Yunnan was a key point on the Burma Road. Over 70 years on, Li Yalu still remembers it clearly.
很奇怪，我每次在了军火要经过这个公过桥，日本飞机就在炸。
Between October 1940 and February 1941, there were 16 raids on the bridge. The Japanese were desperate to block the flow of war material.
最怕是它的这个炸弹皮呀，所以你要训练过吧？你飞机来轰炸，你马上要扑在地上，不能跑，不能站，是这样。后来我看，哎呦，可怜的在乡下那边，你看那个妇女呀。 屁股那边这个炸弹皮，打死了好几个，我去看。
In January 1941, the Gongor Bridge was hit and destroyed by the Japanese. A radio broadcast from Tokyo trumpeted how the Burma Road had been cut and would be out of action at least 3 months. Despite the success of the road, the Chinese army was still desperately short of ammunition. The Japanese at that time had no such problems. The loss of the road could cost China the war. The situation was critical.
炸掉了，我跟这个站长啊商量啊，我们这个空油桶很多啊，这个空油桶来做浮桥。
The volunteers and local people strung the empty oil barrels together with wire hawsers and then lashed planks on top to make a road surface. The supply trucks could roll across once more. The ingenious improvisation meant the road was opened again in under 12 hours. But now events on the other side of the Pacific were about to come into play.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
The details are not available. The White House is now giving out a statement.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked.
In the wake of their attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese sought to overrun all of Southeast Asia. On December 9th, they took Bangkok. On the 10th, Guam was occupied. And on the 25th, they attacked Hong Kong. All of these were steps aimed at isolating Rangoon, the port which marked the starting point of the supply route. At the time, more than 80,000 tons of munitions were stuck in Rangoon. According to an American eyewitness, the docks of Rangoon were piled high with war material. Rows and rows of trucks and military jeeps, and boxes upon boxes of rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, and grenades. In early 1942, the Japanese army occupied the whole of Southeast Asia. In January, it occupied Malaya. In February, Singapore fell. Rangoon itself was captured by March. Now the Japanese army had a hand on the throat of China's southern lifeline. On March 12, 1942, the Chinese Expeditionary Force, a force of 100,000 men, entered Burma to defend the Burma Road. Wang Jiagui now had a new mission. Instead of transporting oil and ammunition, he was to carry the soldiers of the Chinese Expeditionary Force into Burma.
他这个验证针没有盘好，是那个针没有的。 就是笼统是远征军，上坡的时候停了休息，就水还没有。看大象来给我们打，看你当兵你给他打象，我说我不会打，他笑了，当兵都不会打象。我在他说你打一个打一个，给我想想，我们拿了打那么一坐屁股坐下地下，他笑了。 他说：“你们这个当兵怎么当的？”我说：“我们是这个兵，我们是当这个兵，开现实的。”
Wang Jiagui drove the soldiers of the Expeditionary Force and their equipment to the supply hub at La Shio in northern Burma. His truck was then loaded with military supplies to take back to Yunnan.
规定给你3天往返，今天把河装好，明早上走，3天到昆明下了河，3天再跑回来下关。他是这样想的，他物资多了嘛，他拉到昆明部队车子来拉走，
However, the operation didn't last long. The British forces were being driven out of Burma by a Japanese offensive, which soon began to turn its attention to the Chinese Expeditionary Force. Within a month, they too found themselves on the retreat. On April 29, 1942, Zheng Zheyuan was leading a convoy of 8 trucks carrying anti-aircraft ammunition and communications equipment bound for La Xiao. As they approached their destination, Zheng came across Expeditionary Force vehicles retreating back up the road. The Japanese were attempting to encircle La Xiao. Zheng ordered his convoy to halt.
突然听见轰的一声爆炸，像我父亲在他的回忆录里面写的，他们像惊弓之鸟。返回到基地以后，基地人就跟他们讲，昨天晚上12点的时候，有缅甸的部队把腊戌大枪的把它炸了，为了阻止日军的进攻。
The Japanese strike against La Xiao paralyzed the Burma Road. This is the border town of Wanding in Yunnan. In April 1942, its streets were flooded with refugees from Burma, both Chinese and Burmese, civilian and military.
那个的世世代代汉人啦，哎呀，汉人那个华侨的那里，多来一个，又来一个，包一个，找不到些地点，那都一路都是发展，乱得很，你也不敢给他。 你假如你要说有好钱就给他做，那个是不可能的，一饿就上来了，你就不可能的。好多的拿便当来，一来我就拿便当刷，那他们也去，还有。
With the Japanese army pursuing them on land and Japanese aircraft parrying them from above, the flood of refugees all but brought the road to a standstill.
我从龙陵到老路边，晚上3点多从龙陵出发，龙陵到了孟海70公里嘛，走了1晚，过个1半天才到这，一路都是雪。
With the Chinese Expeditionary Force in slow retreat, the Japanese raced towards the Chinese border to cut them off. In just 2 days, the Japanese advance guard covered over 200 kilometers to reach the Weitong Bridge on the New Jiang River. The Weitong Bridge was a key strategic crossing point. On either side lay the mountains, over 3,000 meters above sea level. If the Japanese captured the bridge, they could move directly into Yunnan and then isolate Chongqing, China's wartime capital. Sai Ruchu witnessed the drama that took place on May 5, 1942.
那天早上5点钟左右了，天蒙蒙，还看不很清楚。我们因为那个车跑不了，我们就丢掉车就跑路咯。跑路看见他就警开车拉着那个小炮也不大，他第一部车开灯，其他的车跟后的车全部不开灯，只是后面挂住一块白布。 你这个后面的车就跟着他那块白布前进，还没有讲到这就紧嘛， 就以为是国民党军撤退了，所以我同我爱人就拦住台车，停车杀那个国民党兵嘛。我们也不知道，我的爱人就爬上车哦，搭上车了，从车后面搭上去了，要先生给我坐车。
It turned out that this was an advance unit of the Japanese army racing towards the Weitong Bridge. There were dozens of Japanese vehicles disguised as KMT ones.
他就推我爱人下来，前面去，就推下来，我又跟着他后面来咯，一跑到旁边，因为我要跑路就拿着一个旅行袋，带着一条烟筒，一双鞋子。他就仅看见我拿一个袋呢，就要我那个东西就叫拿来。我一看，是日本兵啊，因为我举着啊，我就丢给他了，就拉我爱人跑上路边的山啊。哎呀，真是怕哦。
When the Japanese reached the Weitong Bridge, it was in chaos, packed with vehicles, refugees, and soldiers. As they started to cross, the KMT engineers decided to destroy it. A huge blast took down the bridge, taking all with it, vehicles and people, Chinese and Japanese, into the waters of the Nujiang River. The destruction of the Weitong Bridge marked the final cutting of the Burma Road. From then on, Chinese and Japanese forces confronted each other from either side of the Nujiang River. For overseas transport volunteers, the Burma Road had been their raison d'etre. What was to become of them now that the road was cut? After Southeast Asia fell to the Japanese, overseas Chinese were faced with persecution and mass killings. Over 100,000 people died. Join us for our next episode, The Survivors. Wang Jiagui was 26 when he met his wife. As a transport volunteer driving up and down the hazardous Burma Road, he never had time to spare a thought for love. But fortune was to smile on him.
谢谢。哎呀，哎呀，我这说不来。我认识他的，我那次猜的16岁、17岁、17岁的，因为他经常开车，开车子呢，就在干，他开得很好啊，这工作踏实了，啊。
In 1939, Wang Jiagui left his home in Kuala Lumpur and returned to China. He was part of the supply company of the 14th Brigade of the Southwest Transport Division. His unit was stationed at Baoshan in Yunnan Province. Their 16-year-old next-door neighbor, Lord Chun Feng, was attracted to this cheerful and hard-working young man.
父母亲嘛对我好，所以老人嘛做主，
On May 3, 1942, Wang Jiagui and Lord Chun Feng held their wedding ceremony at the Hong Yun Tower in Baoshan. Several other of the transport volunteers and the bride's best friend attended the ceremony.
我有个同学叫范有华，我两个处得相当好，处得相当好呢，坐一个位置。
The day after their wedding, the young couple were to travel from Baoshan to Dali. They planned to celebrate their marriage with his comrades there. But the young couple's joy was soon turned to dread.
日本飞机炸过了吗？
飞机响了。
飞机上了，宝山上，大声吧。
那个声音就呜，那个响。
炮弹在那放着嘛，那北京给我炮弹下来了嘛，让开的。
嘘，一个一个就掉下来了。哇，天，什么就倒下来了？
这滚弹一定咔嘛4、5烧人嘛。
到处是烧了一片焦土，死到抬人的都没有了。
The Japanese air raids on May 4, 1942 were the biggest disaster to befall Baoshan in all of its history. 90% of the civilian housing was destroyed, and nearly 10,000 people were killed or injured. Lord Chun Feng's best friend and maid of honor, Fan Yonghua, was one of those who died.
他这个母亲不是被炸了，把他炸死了，他妈就可寺庙里吃斋去了，当和尚去了啊。接着我就哭啊，我可瞧他，接着我也哭，他也哭啊，太惨了啊，这个时候啊，
On May 5th, the day after the Japanese air raids, the Chinese army blew up the Huitong Bridge over the Nujiang River to prevent the Japanese from seizing it. This meant the Burma Road was cut. All of a sudden, Wang and his comrades were out of work. The transport units were soon disbanded. No job meant no pay. To survive, Wang Jiagui and his wife decided to leave Yunnan. But with the Japanese air raids continuing, where could they go?
改善了没有办法了，就出去找工作了嘛。我们是苏大队的大队长，对我很好。后来他在双田东路当队长，他现在喊我到俺那边当那个分队长。
The job offer came in the nick of time. His monthly salary was 36 Chinese yuan, a modest salary, but enough to support the young couple. But Wang Jiagui became disillusioned with his new job very quickly, and it had nothing to do with the pay.
因为我还在那个工作还危险的，他那个驾驶员偷卖汽油，他那边都是用酒精，他卖的一桶一桶的卖，我们看见抓到我们要去坐牢，所以我看见了太危险了，我就先假回国内。
He was by then quite familiar with Kunming. It had been his first stop upon returning to China. But it was now full of unemployed drivers and mechanics who had served in the overseas transport volunteers. Lord Kai-hu was among those scratching around to survive in the city.
我大家几个人，当年我还有一点钱，嘛就集中来开一个管自带水壶，还有一个招待所，专门做西餐的。当地这种我们老乡太多了啊，一天几十个人来吃饭，你没有办法，还要几个人嘛就到海多了。
Times were hard. The Japanese had overrun all of Burma, and the supply route from the south was lost. For the next 3 years, supplies had to be flown to China from India over the hump, the Himalayas. With no fuel to run their trucks, the volunteers found themselves trapped and with no means of making a living. The Ministry of Transportation found some of them a place to stay in the suburbs of Kunming. The photographs taken when they arrived at their new quarters showed a very ragged crew compared to the smartly uniformed young men of 1939. (1943) was the 7th year of the Sino-Japanese War, and by then the city of Kunming was suffering serious shortages. Thousands of refugees were living in shacks, surviving on meager rations of rotten food. The lot of the leftover transport volunteers was as desperate as any.
好多花椒，那就没有办法，嘛，饿死的也有。 临时的有带空人街嘛，噶当年的空人街。
2个战友，10年了嘛，没有地方睡，跑到南门那边有防空洞，那个山上就挖了个防空洞，他2个睡在里面，那个战友们死了，他早上起来不是跑了，离开这个战友，你不敢见，你没有钱了。 你要钱嘛，你要有钱给省钱来收嘛。你没有钱的嘛，公家是收掉了，哎。
But if things were bad for the overseas transport volunteers stuck in China, they were even worse for their families and friends back in Southeast Asia. (1942) had seen the whole region fall under Japanese control. On the 15th of February, 1942, the British forces in Singapore had suddenly surrendered to the Japanese. The fall of Singapore shocked the world. Britain's wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, later called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For the Singaporean Chinese, it was a disaster that was to turn into a living nightmare.
日本军占领了马来亚和新加坡之后呢，给人的印象是根本就是残杀戮戮了，一种报复的行为了，也根本没有分到底为什么要抓你，为什么要杀你。
This monument commemorates the thousands of Singaporean Chinese who died in the Suk Ching massacre carried out by the Japanese. It was aimed at exterminating all those hostile to Japanese rule, especially the Chinese. Among them were the relatives and friends of the transport volunteers.
2月15号登陆之后，2月18号到2月25号，1个礼拜之内，被抓的人有整10万个人，不分青红皂白，带到海边，带到偏僻乡村，就是枪杀。那么战后呢，假如根据日本的那个官方记录呢，他们认为在占领新加坡期间呢，被杀害的只有5000个人。
Many parts of Asia were scarred by Japanese atrocities. From Nanjing to Manila, from Singapore to Pontianak, an Asian Holocaust was perpetrated against civilians of all ethnicities. But always chief among their targets were those of Chinese ancestry. Tan Kah Kee, leader of the Singaporean Chinese community, came at the top of the wanted list by the Kempei Tai, the Japanese paramilitary secret police. After the fall of Singapore, Tan escaped to Indonesia. After Indonesia fell, the Japanese put a price on Tan's head.
每到每个人的家里头去，他不想连累那一家人，他的身边呢，口袋里头都有一小包的这个砒霜，以防万一他被日本人找到的话，他马上服那个砒霜自杀。
Tan Kah Kee was in great danger, but he didn't forget the transport volunteers his China Relief Fund had recruited and sent to China. When he heard of their plight, he charged his close friend Hao Se-huan with carrying out a rescue plan he had organized. Today, downtown Singapore is littered with spectacular luxury apartments. One of them, Hamilton Scott's, has been built on the site of what was the hub of Tan's rescue mission.
Okay, behind me is the Hamilton Scott. It stands at the location of where Hao Se-huan's residence was when he left Singapore. At that time, it was a very big bungalow with many rooms and a big compound with a lot of fruit trees.
Hao Se-huan was another of the wealthy Singaporean Chinese who assisted China in the war. In 1940, he and Tan organized a support group from the China Relief Fund to visit the transport volunteers working in China. Now with the volunteers unemployed and destitute, Hao became acutely concerned. In 1942, he wrote in a letter to his friends, "I hope you can take care of them because these capable men are our country's lifeline. We should nurture them to revive our country. I hope you'll agree with me." Hao Se-huan sought to raise 500,000 Chinese yuan to help the transport volunteers and their dependents stuck in Yunnan. He sent agents to Kunming and Dali to provide assistance.
He also tried to find jobs for them, and there are because of the harsh conditions that the mechanics were in, some of them became addicted to opium. So he helped quite a few of these opium addicts to kick their habit of relying on opium and help them to start a new life.
The erstwhile wretched condition of the volunteers was dramatically improved. Meanwhile, the war was turning against the Japanese and in the favor of the Allies. In May 1944, the Chinese Expeditionary Army recrossed the New Jiang River. November 9th, 1944 was a very special day for the overseas transport volunteers. They gathered at Kunming Airport to receive Mr. Hao Se-huan, who was arriving for the groundbreaking ceremony for a new school. It was a school he had funded for the children of those transport volunteers who had married and started families in Yunnan. At 9 o'clock in the morning, his plane came into sight above the airfield. But disaster was to strike before their very eyes.
Actually given up his seat for someone else, but in the end, the pilot managed to find a seat for him at the co-pilot place. So he was on that fateful flight when the plane crashed. Though the plane burst into flame, his body was not burned because his whole seat was ejected from the plane when it crashed. So they managed to find his body, even with his name card in his pocket and a photograph that he wanted to give to Pai Ching-chen. But unfortunately, that photograph was then used.
By January 1945, the Burma Road was opened once again. It was a new road this time, which brought supplies from Lador in Assam. For the overseas transport volunteers, The end of their long road of travails was in sight. With the war ending, how would the still young volunteers face another new horizon? Could they return to Southeast Asia after these years of turmoil? Or would the new lives they had made for themselves keep them fast in China? Join us for Part 5, The Power of Love.
什么结束？结束，结束。听不懂，我听不懂。
你这个不会说这么多。
年轻的时候到中国去打日本，现在后悔不后悔？人生会有。
板桥金出一山。
来华侨参加打日本呐，是吧？打日本呐。